Welcome to Walk Talk, the Faith in Motion podcast, where two regular guys talk about their walk with Christ. We're not pastors, we're not priests, just passionate followers of Jesus, here to give an account of the hope that lies within us. We don't shy away from the tough topics or the challenging scriptures. We just share our faith, and we hope that you find it helpful. We're your hosts, Randy Dupree and PJ Verdon. Thanks for joining us today. All right, man. Let's get into it today.
Let's talk about it, brother.
All right, so let's talk about the tithe. I'm sure this is a topic that everyone's been waiting to hear. What do these guys think about the tithe?
Yeah, man. Tithing is one of those funny topics. People definitely feel certain types of ways about it, and it brings up a lot of, awkwardness for a lot of people, even in circles that I've been in, talking to certain people. And I've had people ask me, hey, what do you think about tithing? And, I have my own personal feelings, and I know others do too. So I'm interested to kind of hear yours and then maybe get some feedback on what y'all think out there.
Yeah, this guy I used to work with, I also consider him a friend of mine. I think it was about a year ago or so, when my engine blew up on me in my Jeep, and I had to pay for a whole new engine. The first thing he said to me was, "You see, that's what happens when you don't tithe." And I was like, "Man," I was like, "How do you know if I tithe or not?" And he was just
Right.
like, "That's what happens when you don't tithe." I was like, "All right, I guess, that's all you needed to know was that my engine blew up, and therefore I must not be tithing." So,
Yeah. Dang. That's yeah. I don't remember
but
that.
he probably got a good feeling for where I stand on it because I told him that, one of the reasons why I didn't like his church, not that I ever went on a Sunday, but I did go for other activities at his church, was because he had told me that his pastor preaches on the tithe every single week. He's like, "Every week, my pastor's like, make sure you're giving that 10%, make sure you're tithing, make sure you give tithes and offerings." And he said that his pastor just hammers that every week. And I was like, "Okay, man." I was like, "'Cause I really like your church other than that. Like, you guys do good activities. There's always concerts and speakers and things going on."
But
I
yeah, he's
said, "But"
pushing that basket around. He has the
Yeah,
funds to
yeah.
do whatever he wants, apparently.
But I think, me and Isabel went for, they had, like, a couples night for Thanksgiving. There was a concert we went to, and they host, like, speakers and things like that, and I said, "Man, I really like a lot of things that your church is doing. They're doing a lot of positive stuff." But when he started telling me about that, I was like, "Yeah," it's like, "I don't think I could attend a church that hammers this so hard every week." So he must have just made the assumption then that when
Yeah.
my car broke down, it's because, I hadn't been dropping enough in the basket.
Yeah, but for one, I mean, I don't remember where God's like, hey, listen, if you're not putting a couple dollars in there, then you know what, I'm gonna start making things go bad for you. But I will say, the last church that I was attending, that was one thing that I was pretty impressed with, was the fact that, I mean, in the 2 years and some change that I went there, man, he maybe mentioned, money once or twice, like, but never really, that was, never really a thing. And I think, the only time he ever even really mentioned anything about tithing was to kind of talk the to the point of why he doesn't have a basket, and you know what I mean, like, pass around. And man, I respected that, because I mean, even, and I guess not to say that there's anything wrong with passing a basket, it's
Right,
up to
right.
the person whether or not they want to or can. But I even remember being younger, right? So whenever, I guess, the expectation was not even so high, but you're sitting there and the person to your left puts in some money, and then the basket gets to you and you got nothing to put in there, and then you pass it off and they put money, and you feel like crap. You're like, oh well, apparently,
Peer pressure.
yeah,
Yeah.
100%. It's like, oh, apparently I don't love the Lord as much as y'all do, because I came in here with empty pockets.
Well, I don't remember, who I was in church with, but I remember going to Catholic church as a kid, and I thought the rule was you put $1 in there when the basket came because that just seemed to be the standard. Everybody was doing it. Everyone was putting $1, and I just remember thinking, "Okay, that's what we do. When the basket comes, we put $1." I don't remember learning any more about it at that time, just that was the thing to do. I don't know if that's like a Catholic tradition, and all Catholics do that, or if that was just, person I was with or the place that I was at.
Yeah, I don't remember that part. I definitely remember them. They pass around a little gold plate though, you know what I mean? So it's uh,
Right,
and
right.
I think they gotta dump it sometimes, just to
Yeah,
pass it back.
yeah.
But yeah, man, I don't remember for sure. It's been a
Well,
while.
I'll tell you, there's been a couple churches, that I've gone to, that we have gone to in the last few years, that have had a really good approach to tithing, and, you know, especially when it came to preaching about it from the from the pulpit, right? And, you know, I'll hold back from saying the names of churches when I might have some criticism, but because I think this is really good, I'm gonna say that this was at Two Rivers Church. That was one of the churches that I remember, and I think there was another one as well, but they essentially said, "Look, you know, as your pastors, we don't know who gives what. Just that's between you and God, and we purposefully don't wanna know." So, you know, they said something to the effect of, you know, "If you've been giving a whole lot and you're waiting for me to, like, give you a call and thank you, it's not gonna happen. And if you're not giving anything and you're waiting for me to give you a call and, like, criticize you, that's not gonna happen either because, like, we purposefully don't wanna know. We keep that to the elders and the leadership team, you know, to sort through that, but as your, like, pastoral staff, we don't know, we don't care."
Right, and that's how it should be, man. Like realistically, you know, and I guess for the people who would be waiting to get the call to get the pat on the back, doesn't sound like they're giving for the right reasons either. I guess you know what I mean.
Well, I mean, yeah, and I'll tell you, I've also remember as a very young man, I worked at a call center, and right next to me was a pastor who also worked at the call center, and he was one of the pastors at his church. He wasn't the main pastor, so I don't know if he collected a salary. If he did, I'm sure it probably wasn't much, which is why he worked at the call center where I worked. And I will say that this guy, he showed up with excellence. I mean, he was the model. They recorded him for, like, training purposes. Literally, the call center was recording this guy because he was such a good example of how to, like, be pleasant and positive and treat your customers. But I remember talking to him because, you know, he knew I was a Christian. I knew he was a pastor, and he invited me to go to his church, which I never did attend. But one of the things that I remember about this guy, and I won't say his name or what church he went to, but he told me that when you became a member of their church, that you had to submit your W-2s, and that they wanted to make sure that you were not only giving 10%, but you were giving 10% of your gross, not of your net, because they wanted to hold their their congregation accountable to the tithe. So that's how far some churches take it. So one example I just mentioned, we have a church that says, "Hey, that's between you and God. I don't even want to know about it." Another church says, "Give us your W-2." So there's a wide spectrum
Right.
of how Christians are handling the tithe.
100%. So what do we have a definition? I guess it would probably have to be a biblical definition of what tithing
Yeah,
actually is, because according to Google, right here, the definition of tithing is the practice of taking or paying a tithe. And
well,
I'm
there
like,
you go.
well,
Does it get any more
that's just circular.
straightforward than that?
Right. Well, and so this down here says, according to Christianity.com, uh, the term tithe means tenth,
Hmm.
and tithing refers to the practice of giving 10% of one's income or resources to the church or religious community.
Right.
Now, also going back to Google's definition of tithing, they don't really specify here what if this is just like the US or if this is globally. But this says, according to Google, that receipts from tithing range from 2.5 billion with a B to 4.3 billion each year.
Okay.
Tithing.
Okay. All right. Well, let me jump in there because I did a little research myself, and I'm going to mispronounce this word, but according to the research I did, again to confirm what you said, biblically the word tithe literally means a tenth. But specifically, it's a tenth of one's increase, not a tenth of everything they own, just a tenth of their increase. So essentially, their
Mm,
income, right?
got you.
Not a tenth of everything you're worth, but a tenth of what you have over this year, over last year. And it comes from a Hebrew word, which I'm going to mispronounce, which is something like ma'aser, which translates into tenth.
That's
And
spot on.
It's spot on.
That's
That's
spot on.
someone correct us in the comments if you have a phonetic spelling that would probably be helpful. What I'm looking at is like MA''ASER, Ma'aser. I don't know, but it's mainly in the Hebrew Bible it was mainly focused on crops, livestock, income, anything really from the land that a person might count as part of their increase. And the purpose was really to support the Levites, who were the priests, and all of the temple services and the care for the poor and the teaching of the word of God and things like that.
Yep. And didn't, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't tithing start with Melchizedek, or
That
was
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's the very first reference to tithe. It probably is,
I think
but it
so,
does say that Abraham tithed to
to
Melchizedek,
Melchizedek,
right?
right? Melchizedek basically told him like, "Hey, 10%, pal." You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. So obviously, Melchizedek was definitely someone of importance, right? And I know a lot of people think he was like a
Well,
pre-incarnate version of Christ
well,
or
I
or
think
something
I
like
think
that.
there's actually debate on whether or not he was like a Christophany, like whether or not he was Christ, because
Right,
it
right,
doesn't give him a beginning or an end kind of thing. So there's some
right.
back and forth, which we won't necessarily get into all that.
Yeah,
Um,
we'll save the speculation on that for another time. We'll stick with tithe for today. So you mentioned the total tithe that's collected annually, right? I don't know if you have this stat in front of you, but did you know that on average, Christians give anywhere between 2.5 to 4% of their income to tithe?
I didn't know that. It's wild, and I don't know if this is maybe jumping the gun, but I can tell you one thing that I feel like really got put onto my heart and and made me look at tithing in a different way is, I guess traditionally, for those people who do know what tithing is it they make that synonymous with money. And what I realize is there's more ways to tithe than just, pulling your wallet out. Because at one point, I mean, full transparency, I felt like the Lord, I'd surrendered being very much focused on money and as the gauge in which I measured myself. Um, and I surrendered that to the Lord and was like, you know what, I know that you'll take care of me. And so I was trusting in Him. And then I saw, I was making progression. I went from working at a job where, you know, I was bringing in like 1,000 plus less dollars. Like, so I was making at least 1,000 less dollars a month than my bills were. And God was still providing. And so whenever, I got to the point where I was making, enough money to where I could pay my bills and buy a pizza, you know what I mean? I was like, well, shoot, I want to tithe this money. And so I approached it very, whenever I guess, or early on, I would say, from a very legalistic, I was like, I told my wife I want to give 10% of my check before taxes, and that's the approach that I took. And I did that for, I don't know, uh, not very long. And then, she and I had a conversation, and we kind of talked about it, and she actually is the one that kind of opened my eyes up. She was like, she does helps out with children ministry. She cleans the church, her and some of the other girls. They rotate on the schedule. And also, we would pitch in for like buying, supplies, paper towels, toilet paper, soap for the bathroom, cleaning supplies, stuff like that. And so she was like, I know you want to just give 10% for, she's like, and if that's what you want to do, that's what I'll do. But she's like, just understand that, there's other ways to tithe, which is, time and service and
Yeah.
and and help. So
Well, hey, friends, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. And I just want to take a minute to tell you about my book, Everyday Lead. So if you haven't already purchased the book, it's available on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles. And if you have already purchased the book, then thank you so much for your support. Please leave me a review, it helps out a lot. If you're wondering what it's about, well, I'll just tell you, I have 25 years of working in aerospace manufacturing, leading lean transformation, continuous improvement, and Six Sigma projects. And I've tried to take all that knowledge and experience and simplify it so that the average person with no manufacturing experience would not only understand the concepts, but would also be able to apply some very simple tools to their own processes to help eliminate waste. So it doesn't matter whether you're baking a cake or whether you are a nurse or a doctor working in the medical field, or you are an accountant or an attorney. Anywhere there is a process, there is going to be waste. And I'm not talking about rubbish. I'm not talking about things that are left over. I'm talking about defects, overproduction, waiting, non utilized talent, transportation, inventory, motion, excess processing. This simple book, and as you guys can see, it's a very short read here. You can probably get through it in just a couple hours. Basically will help you to understand what that waste looks like in your process and give you some basic guidelines on how to eliminate it. So thank you for your time. I hope you check out the book and enjoy the rest of the show. Well, let me just jump in and say, thanks for sharing your experience. But I would say that Christians probably would disagree with you on that statement about how different ways there are to tithe. I wouldn't personally, because, and I'll tell you why in a minute. In terms of what I think about the tithe. But I think there's a lot of Christians and a lot of churches out there who would probably say that, look, all those other things are maybe an offering above and beyond the tithe, but you need to be strict about like 10%, income as your tithe. And then the other things that you mentioned, whether it's time or providing resources or giving to other charities and things like that, that would be offering. And I'm not saying I adhere to that, but I've heard that
Yeah,
from
definitely.
different churches that I've been a part of. I've heard churches say, no, your 10% needs to go to the church that's feeding you. That's for the pastor's salary. That's to keep the lights on in the building, all that sort of stuff, and then all those other things would be extra. So just throwing that out there that, there's definitely a lot of different ways that, people are looking at tithe.
Well, and I guess let's clarify because I mean that is another thing that I have seen in certain churches is they don't call it tithing, they call it an offering. So I guess
Sure,
what
sure.
would be I mean I to me I would say they're the same thing, but I could see how somebody would delineate the two. Like, no, tithing, offering. Like, you know what I mean? I can see that
Yeah. So
separation. I don't necessarily look at it like that, but I can see how people would.
Right, and I think if we were going back to the Old Testament, the offerings seem to be pretty specific. There's the burnt offerings, there's grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and I think the main difference is that this is your free giving above the 10%. And I think that most Christians typically use that same mindset today. Is that those things would be offerings above and beyond, just like those burnt offerings would have been in addition to any tithing that the Jews would have done under the Levitical priesthood.
Well, it's funny because whenever I was thinking about this earlier today, I remember in the previous episode, you said something to the effect of, isn't it funny how we call it spending time? You know what I mean? And
Mm,
so in the same kind of context, I look at it like, if you're gonna take time, I mean, and it did, I mean, either way, my wife would drive, make a 2 hour round trip there and back to clean. You know what I mean?
mhm.
Amongst having other things, and so I mean, like I said, whenever we talked about, it, I was like, okay, that we are contributing to the church in more ways than just what we're putting into the
Yeah,
the drop box.
sure,
Um,
sure.
so yeah,
Let me just back up a little bit because I did want to just quote a couple verses that we maybe skipped over a little bit when we were defining tithe. So just for everyone's edification out there who might be, wanting to throw something in the chats, please do leave the comments,
absolutely.
your verses on tithe if I miss any. But Leviticus 27:30 says a tithe of everything from the land belongs to the Lord. Deuteronomy 14:22 says, well, it basically explains how the tithes support the Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows. We'll come back to that in a second. Malachi 3:10 says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. Um, and ultimately, like we mentioned, it is the tenth of your increase, and that's where Leviticus 27 makes it specific. It's everything from the land that belongs to the Lord, right? It's a tenth of that increase. that we're focusing specifically on if we're talking, under the Levites. And I think if you think about what that was being used for, so going back to Deuteronomy, it says to support the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, the widows. That brings me to the purpose of the old covenant tithe, which if you think about it, in under the old covenant, this was really the ancient Hebrews taxes that they paid, right? They didn't have taxes necessarily that they paid to like a government, right? I don't know. I don't know if they did or not, but I know this was basically their taxes. And if you think about what their taxes was going to, it was supporting, the priests who were in charge of the temple. It was for taking care of the widows and the orphans and the poor, and basically for the teaching, so the education of the people. So a lot of what our taxes go to today, which I know, like my property tax, for example, which tripled when I moved from Colorado to St. Louis, pretty much all goes to the education system, the paying salaries of teachers and faculty and staff, and getting the education to the kids, roads, highways, all these things, right? Welfare systems, food stamps, all these kind of things. It's kind of similar, in my opinion, the taxes that we pay to our government, when you compare it to what the Levites, were doing with the tithe.
I like that verse. What did whenever I think it was Peter asked Jesus about paying the taxes, and he's like, "Whose face is on that coin?" No,
Right, right.
give it to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So yeah,
Yeah. Now, and see, that was a little bit later, right? So,
yeah,
you're
absolutely. A
right to
lot,
say
lot
that
later.
yeah, they were paying taxes, to the Romans. I guess it'd be good for us to look up if they paid taxes, other than to the Levites before the Roman occupation. So I'm thinking, like, under the kings, did
Oh,
they
yeah.
pay
Oh, absolutely.
any
I'd
sort
imagine
of
so.
taxes?
Yeah, I, I'd imagine so.
Yeah. But it sounds like a lot of the purpose of the tithe, was going to similar purposes as our taxes do today. That was kind of where I was thinking when I was reading through, the purpose of the tithe back then.
Right, right,
I
right.
think another purpose of the tithe that's not explicitly mentioned, is more of a practical reason, a practical purpose, which is just to teach money management, right? Like management of resources. Like if you're able to actually set aside a tenth and not spend everything that you have, I think that's probably a good idea, right? And if you're able to do that, you're probably going to have discipline that's going to, make you more successful in other areas of life, especially with money, because that is one of the hardest areas. That's one of the hardest things to do, is not just spend everything you have, but actually save some, or put some aside for some sort of offering.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also just a lesson in giving in general. You know what I mean? Um, just and not just uh as money with money as a focal point, but
Right, right. So let's talk about the purpose of the tithe as it's taught today, and we've kind of mentioned early on different things that we've heard, in terms of how it's being taught. And one verse that I hear a lot that gets thrown around a lot is Malachi 3:10, which says, "Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and therefore put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down a blessing, until there is no more need." So I hear that verse a lot, where people say, "Hey, this is the one time where God says to put him to the test, and it has to do with the tithe." What do you think about that verse when you hear that verse today?
man, um, I really I don't know, to be honest with you. That's I mean I really don't know. I mean my whole understanding of the tithe is in that Second Corinthians verse. But so yeah, I mean I really don't know how to
Which one in Second Corinthians? We could come back to that question. Are you talking Second Corinthians 9:7?
yes, yes. So and I guess that's where you know m- that's what I have heard preached more
Mhm.
recently, and
Okay.
and so that's kind of what stuck with me and kind of brought me out of that old covenant Old Testament mind frame of like, oh, it has
Right.
to be 10%, has to be blah blah blah, blah,
Right.
more legalistically, which is for context, 2 Corinthians 9:7 is each one must give as he decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God's love, for God loves a cheerful giver.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's basically, it's like, man, as long as you're giving, kind of like we mentioned multiple times, it's just it all falls back to the posture of the heart, the
Right.
motivation
Right.
behind what you're doing and why you're doing it. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Hey, friends, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. And I just want to take a minute to tell you about my book, Everyday Lead. So, if you haven't already purchased the book, it's available on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles. And if you have already purchased the book, then thank you so much for your support. Please leave me a review, it helps out a lot. If you're wondering what it's about, well, I'll just tell you I have 25 years of working in aerospace manufacturing, leading lean transformation, continuous improvement, and Six Sigma projects. And I've tried to take all that knowledge and experience and simplify it so that the average person with no manufacturing experience would not only understand the concepts, but would also be able to apply some very simple tools to their own processes to help eliminate waste. So it doesn't matter whether you're baking a cake or whether you are a nurse or a doctor working in the medical field, or you are an accountant or an attorney. Anywhere there is a process, there is going to be waste. And I'm not talking about rubbish. I'm not talking about things that are left over. I'm talking about defects, overproduction, waiting, non utilized talent, transportation, inventory, motion, excess processing. This simple book, and as you guys can see, it's a very short read here. You can probably get through it in just a couple hours. Basically will help you to understand what that waste looks like in your process and give you some basic guidelines on how to eliminate it. So thank you for your time. I hope you check out the book and enjoy the rest of the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, and I mostly align with that verse as well. I mean, full disclosure, we're just two regular guys here. Neither one of us are pastors. We're not priests. We don't have any sort of credentials by our name. Neither one of us has been to Jesus school or whatever they call it, theology school or
And
seminary.
neither one of us
Yeah.
apparently believe that we have to give 10%.
Well, I mean, so going back to what you said about, the legalism. So I definitely do think that, when I hear things quoted like that, when I hear Malachi 3:10, two things jumps out at me. First thing that jumps out at me is, okay, this is a commandment given under the old covenant. We're no longer under the old covenant, we're under the new covenant. So what does the new covenant say? And I would say that it's verses like 2 Corinthians 9:7 that give me a better perspective personally of what the new covenant expects from us, which is, and I've heard pastors say it this way, God, if and I forget exactly how they say it, but they're kind of paraphrasing this verse when they say something to the effect of like, God doesn't want what you don't want to give, or something like that.
Right,
In
right.
other words, like he wants you to give it cheerfully, and he wants you to give it out of faith, and he wants you to sow into the kingdom and not to do it begrudgingly or out of any legalism. If that's where you're at, just keep it. God doesn't need your money, essentially, right? So that's the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that is like, well, what does the new covenant say? And then the other thing I hear is, well, the second half of that verse says, if, I will open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. And I think, okay, well, what does the new covenant say about blessings? Well, I forget the verse, but the new covenant tells me I have everything that I need for life and godliness. I've been given every spiritual blessing. What more do I need today in the under the new covenant from God? I really don't need anything else from God. He's given me his spirit. What else do I need from him? And to me, the answer is nothing. So therefore, if I'm reading this verse, I'm seeing, okay, if I do this legalistic thing, I'm going to get a blessing I already receive. Versus the new covenant that says, like, hey, you've already been given everything, but whatever you give now should be out of love. It should be out of your desire to, you know, the desire of your heart and not under any kind of compulsion. It should be cheerfully.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And man, realistically, in that way, I feel like that's a blessing in and of itself, man. Like I like thinking about, like you said, even the way that they did it, for the widower and stuff like that. Like, And, you don't never know what people are going through. And I mean, a lot of people who are in these situations are I wouldn't even necessarily say that they're prideful about it, but they're just not complainers, man. They're quiet about it. You know what I mean? They're not gonna openly ask, and it might necessarily just be out of pride, but just out of like, man, I don't want to bother nobody with my issues. And so, like you said, giving with a good heart and sowing into the kingdom, and taking something that God has, basically allowed you to do, and being able to you know bless somebody else, man. I just, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, there's a lot of just, I don't know. It just makes my heart happy.
Well, and I will say that, I mentioned earlier what some people might say if they're being very strict and legalistic about the tithe versus an offering
Right, right, right,
versus
right.
your income versus any sort of like time that you might give or other resources. And I would say that I'm more aligned with you on, look, not everyone has money to give in terms of a tithe. Some people have talents that they choose to give and time that they choose to give and resources that they currently have. Some people have a gift that they just can't help but make money. Everything they do turns to gold, and they have plenty of money to give. I would never tell that person who just has extra wealth and resources that, hey, you can't just give time, you also got to give your money. And I wouldn't tell the person who doesn't have the money, hey, you can't just wait, did I say that backwards? Yeah, I wouldn't tell the wealthy person you can't just give money, you also got to give time. And I wouldn't tell someone who doesn't have the extra resources you can't just give time, you got to give money. I would say, look, for each one of you, whether you are super wealthy or whether you are barely making ends meet, I would say that do what you want to do out of that cheerful heart that Second Corinthians talks about.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, with that being said, I will also mention that in First Corinthians, chapter 9, 13 and 14, it says, "Those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel." So I do believe that it is important that we as Christians, support our local church and that we support our pastors that we, whose church we attend, because it says right there that they should essentially receive their, wages from the preaching of the gospel. However, just to kind of like, take another look at that, Paul himself said in Second Thessalonians that when he was with the Thessalonians, that they worked and they didn't want to be a burden on anybody. So they actually worked and had jobs. I think at some point it says Paul was a tent maker or something like that. So like even though Paul is telling like the Corinthians, hey, like yeah, you guys should give in support of your pastors and your elders and the leaders in your congregation, but at the same time, the example that he was setting was, hey, I don't want to be a burden. I want to preach the gospel everywhere I go. And if you have something to give me, great. But if not, then I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm just going to work.
Yep. Yeah, I'm not gonna not give the message because I can't support myself. I'll support myself and still give the message. And
Right. Right.
that's a pretty powerful message, man, realistically. Because unfortunately, you know, and this is not to get way too far ahead of ourselves, but you know, um, you and I were having some conversations earlier about how grossly misused tithing can be towards these pastors, mega pastors who are just, you know, basically doing it for their own just glorification. You know what I mean? For their own fleshly desires, for sure.
Yeah, and that's a good point to bring up because I do believe that so I do believe in, what Paul teaches in First Corinthians that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from that work because it is work. It's not easy. Being a pastor of a church is not easy. If it was, maybe you or me would be pastors, but we're not because it's not an easy job and it's not everyone's called to it. So first and foremost, respect and love to all the
Absolutely.
pastors out there who might be listening. This is not us being critical of any teaching. This is just us explaining, the way we interpret the scriptures. So that's first and foremost that yes, they should receive their salary from that work because it is work. Um, but yeah, at the same time, there should be some sort of system of accountability in place to make sure that the funds that are received are being used wisely and for the purposes that are outlined in the scriptures. Because, like you just mentioned, we know that there's a lot of abuse that goes on and misuse of funds. And honestly, I think for a lot of non-believers who maybe like are flirting with Jesus and maybe exploring the church, that's one of their biggest concerns is like, they just want my money. And, these pastors, they see these televangelists on TV and things like that, and they just have this perception, right or wrong, that all they are about is money.
Or on the flip side, you get a lot of false teaching because they're like, man, all I got to get up here and do is read out this Bible and interpret it however I want to, and I could, make all this money because people, there are a lot of people who want something to believe in, right?
Right,
And
right,
I would venture to say that if there was a cap put on like an annual salary that you could max out for a pastor. And once that cap was met, you had to distribute the funds out into the community. You had to, you know, feed the homeless or pay, you know, single parents rent or something like that. I guarantee you there would be a lot of pastors, not all, of course, but a lot of pastors that would stop pushing tithing so much. You know what I mean? If it stopped being directly beneficial to them and they say, okay, listen, you know what? What's the average salary of anybody else who does a job? A man, in this age class or whatever, let's just say it's $70,000 a year. And that might be high. I don't know. But just to say, if a pastor could not make more than $70,000 a year and anything above that, they had to actively get rid of, then I think it would change a lot, man. Because the thing about it is Paul wasn't saying, hey, look, I should be paid so that I can live above everybody else. He's like, no, if I got to, I'll go take a job on, Monday
right,
through
right.
through Saturday to be able to preach on Sunday, just so I can do it, so I can feed myself to
Well,
get to that sermon.
what right, and I think, and we'll let the listeners, fact check us on this in the comments, but I'm pretty sure Paul also talks about elsewhere where he does talk about, "Hey, if you do wanna send me anything, this is for your, like, sowing into the kingdom essentially, so that you could bless other people, more than just saying, 'Hey, you need to bless me, I need to get paid for preaching the gospel.'"
Right, right.
I tend to can't remember the passages, but I tend to think that there was some portion of the New Testament where he's saying something to that effect, like, "Hey, you guys can give, and it's gonna be, used for the kingdom."
Well,
Um,
absolutely. And at that time, I mean, Paul had a lot of mouths around him that he was also trying to help feed. You know what I mean?
right, right.
So
One thing I do wanna say about pastors, so I don't know, I'm in this mode today where I'm giving shout outs to pastors that are doing good things, and, I've been blessed to know a lot of pastors, throughout my life, but, going all the way back to, Pastor Dave Smith in Family
yeah.
Worship Center, one thing that I always remember, there's certain things that I've heard, that guy preach that always stuck with me, 20 plus years later, and one of the things I heard him say was, and I don't remember what the context was, but I heard him say that essentially his salary that he received as the pastor of that church, they looked at the average income in Pueblo, Colorado. What is the average? Which, for those of you who might be listening, Pueblo, Colorado is a very poor blue collar town with a lot of poverty. And Pastor Dave has one of the biggest congregations, if not the biggest congregation in that town. And to take the average salary and say, that's going to be my salary, I thought just showed a lot of like humility, and I thought was a great like model to follow. And I don't know how common that is, but my guess is it's probably not that common.
And for context, I mean, this was 20 something years ago, whenever even the wages weren't even as high as they necessarily are today.
Right,
Right.
right.
So yeah, I mean, Pastor Davis, yeah, he's, you know, the hard thing for me, even though I was around Pastor Dave a lot and I grew up listening to him and always loved him and respected him. I still do think he's a great pastor. Um, but even though I wasn't necessarily listening like I should have been back then, he kind of set the standard for me as what I was looking for. And that was a little bit tricky because I'm like, just because they're not Pastor Dave doesn't mean that they might not, be the next spiritual leader, you know what I mean, that I'll sit under. So
Yeah, I would say though, and I'm right there with you. I mean, the standard was set so high, It's been tough for, any other church that I've been to live up to that standard. But I think, that's something for pastors to consider. I don't know what the average salary is for a pastor. I guess that's something we could look up. But I'm gonna guess that, that's probably not a common tactic that a lot of pastors or church leaders are taking. If I had to guess, I would say that it's, probably higher than the average. I think maybe they might look more at like the size of their organization. If a company had X amount of people, how much would the CEO make
Right, right.
versus the average salary of a town? I think that's probably more in line with what a lot of churches would think. How else could we have these mega pastors with tens of thousands of people who are, earning millions of dollars a year unless they're having that sort of mentality?
Yeah. It's
Hey, friends, I just want to tell you about my book, Everyday Lean. After 25 years of leading continuous improvement projects in the manufacturing world, I came to a simple realization. Lean applies to any process because every process has waste. Whether you're baking a cake, developing software, or building an F 15, the same principles apply. Everyday Lean gives language and structure to what you're likely already doing. It's all about helping people and organizations make their work better every day. Everyday Lean is available now on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles.
crazy, man. It's really crazy. And, yeah, I mean, what oddly enough, a little foreshadowing, but I was looking up some of the best well-known pastors, I guess, in the US. And one of my current favorite pastors, which would be Philip Anthony Mitchell, he wasn't even on the list as far as like, and I'm sure, I guess it only showed like 30 people. Um, and I was kind of happy about that. Now, another pastor that I really like and I follow, Mark Driscoll, he was on there. But I mean, as I feel like he deserves to an extent, of course, not to. I mean, he does preach the word. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with, um, people experiencing an abundance of blessings for being out there, you know, doing the Lord's work. It's just one of those things, man. Um, you know,
Yeah.
it's
Well, so I just did a little research here, and it looks like the average salary in the US for a pastor is 55 to 60K a year, which in 2026 is nothing,
right,
essentially.
right.
I it's gonna sound like I'm bragging when I say this, but, last year I paid almost that much in taxes. So it's a lot of money. Um, not a lot of money is what I'm saying, but I think pastors, have other sources of income too for some of them, like Pastor Mark that you're mentioning, he's an author too, right? So and doesn't he also have like a show,
Podcast,
radio show,
yeah,
podcast?
and
So he's probably got other
conferences,
sources
and
of
yeah, yeah,
income outside
absolutely.
of just his church, his actual salary as a pastor, right?
And right, and I think 100% that is in my opinion, that's a difference, right? It's like, listen, I it's like, you know what? I'll preach the word of God for free, right? But if I'm talented in this other avenue and I'm able to capitalize on this, hey, the God blessed us with, with a sound mind and ambition and all these things. So hey, go out there and get it. Nothing wrong with living in
Right,
abundance. You know what I mean?
right.
What I'm saying is not using the word of God as a platform to, or not, that being your sole reason for saying, you know what, I'm gonna pick up this Bible and preach God's word. It's to
Right, or
become
or for trying to guilt trip people into this Old Testament legalistic, mindset, which honestly, I'll be honest with you, I think that, for most of the preachers who are out there preaching this Malachi 3:10, "Test the Lord by giving and see if he don't bless you,"
right.
I mean, it's either I don't wanna sound judgmental, but I think, for a lot of them, it's either because they are trying to build up their kingdom, either a bigger church building or a more lavish church building or their own personal salary. It's not
100%.
necessarily for, building up the kingdom, because when I think about building up the kingdom, I'm thinking like, how much are you giving to, like, missionaries, people who are out there in the field, whether in our
Doing the
country or
work.
other
Yeah.
countries, yeah, doing the work? How much are we supporting the widow and the orphan and giving to charities and, helping people who, like, can't have, provide the basic things in life for themselves, or maybe just the basics, but not much beyond that? Like, how much of what we're giving is going to that versus to this internal, kingdom, that we're trying to build? And I'm sure there's some out there who are, trying to preach Malachi 3:10 because they want to do kingdom work. But I feel like a lot of the times the people that I hear preaching that, it's not necessarily for the right purposes.
Right. You know what? That actually makes me think about it now that we're talking on it a little bit more, and I guess it's had time to kind of sink in and resonate with me a little bit more. We talked, I think it was last week, about Christian content, and we brought up the book of Eli. So be on the
Yeah,
lookout for that.
the movie, The Book of Eli.
Yeah, the movie, The Book of Eli with Denzel Washington. So be on the lookout for that. I guess. Anyways, but the the antagonist in that, he reminds me of somebody that would preach Malachi, right?
Mm,
Because the thing about it is this: God don't need nothing from us. God's not waiting for me to give him 10% or 100% of my check. He don't need nothing from me, right?
yeah, yeah,
So who serves to benefit from preaching that and me giving 10% and testing God and saying, "Hey man, pastor, I gave him my 10%, but I'm not seeing these blessings." And he's like, "You're not giving enough." Who's benefiting?
right,
You know what I
right,
mean? Because all he does is stand to make more money off of my guilty conscience and my obedience and my will to want to do the right thing. And if it doesn't work out like that, he's like, maybe you haven't pleased the Lord. You know what I mean? So he
mm,
just gets to play this middleman money collector. You know what I mean?
right, right. Yeah, 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 exactly. And yeah, a great movie. And if you didn't see the episode we did on Christian media,
We
make sure you
haven't
guys go back and check that one out.
we haven't dropped it yet. That's why they haven't seen it.
But by the time they hear this one,
Oh yeah.
that one will be out. So
That checks out. Yeah, go back and watch it. But yeah, my bad. But no, but it really, I think that that's 100%. That's a perfect example of reasons why that guy wanted the Bible, because he's like,
right, right.
using the word of God, I can make people do these things and then sit back and say, hey, look, if you're not getting the result, that's between you and God. Meanwhile, just sitting back and soaking up all these
He
benefits.
wanted to use it for manipulation,
100%.
and, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who still, who right now are using it for manipulation and
Yeah.
have throughout history,
Yeah.
from the various different cults and false religions, that have been based on, twisting the scriptures and manipulating people, with combinations of the old and new covenant, or adding things to the Bible that were even in the Bible to begin with, whole new books and chapters. Like, there's been a lot of manipulation of the scriptures.
Sorry. That just
Go ahead.
made me think exactly of Matthew 23:23, where Jesus is basically telling the Pharisees themselves, like,
Right,
y'all
right,
are hypocrites. You know what I mean? Y'all are trying to use this for y'all benefit. You know what I mean?
right. So
So
let's read that. Do you have that in front of you? What does Matthew 23 say?
Matthew 23:23 says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness."
Mm.
So, yeah,
Yeah, so in other words, don't pick and choose what you're gonna enforce
right.
and what you yourself are gonna try to live up to. And I think we've touched on this a little bit, in one of our previous conversations, where we said that there are certain sins that people get really hung up on, and they'll say you're going to hell if you do X, but then other sins that go totally ignored. Like, how often do you hear a pastor get up in front of a church in America and preach on gluttony?
Right.
Not
Never.
very often, but that's the
Never.
sin. I mean, he sees a
100%.
bunch of people who look fat like me, and he's like, "Oh, I'm not gonna touch that one, but let me preach about these other things that no one could actually see outwardly, right? Let's focus in." And I think that's Jesus's point. He's saying like, "Hey, you're focusing on one thing and not the other, but it's the same God who wrote all these commandments, the same God you're offending if you break one of them."
Yep. And I think one that's even more grossly overlooked than that, and is probably just as not, if just as more, if just as common, if not more, is what I'm trying to say. is gossip, man. Gossiping.
Yeah.
Gossiping is thrown in there
Right.
like as one of like the biggest things to not do, right?
Right.
And
Right.
and look, you know, I'll be honest with you. At one point in time in my mind, I was like, man, I'm not gossiping, right? I'm just telling the truth from my side, and
Right.
that's
Right.
wrong. That's wrong. That's
Right.
still gossiping. You know what I mean? And that goes on a lot, man, a lot more.
It
And I think
does.
that it sows so many seeds of discourse and causes so much division. And again, it goes unchecked. Why? Because it's not like one of those buzz things like, oh, nope, let's stick to drugs, alcohol, sex, pornography, whatever. Everybody can sit and I think it's like one of those things. It's like those, you know, thou shalt not commit murder. I haven't murdered nobody. I should be good. Well, thou shalt not lie either. Oh, well, I don't lie. You just lied. You know what I mean? But it's like, okay, well, everybody lies, so we'll just even that one out on the board. But if you kill somebody, you're bad. Like, nope,
Right.
sin, wages, death.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah,
yeah.
100%. Yeah, 100%. So back to the tithe, let me ask you this. I know that neither one of us is in the 1%, as the 1% is often used to talk about the super elite and super wealthy, but are you in the 5%? Are you in the 5%? So 5% roughly of churchgoers consistently give the full 10%. Is that something that you're comfortable stating whether you are or not?
I, I mean, I, like I said, I was for a little while. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Um, I, but then that didn't last very long. And I guess I guess just to add context, I think that, uh, and I don't have the verse in front of me, but my 10% would have been like that the poor woman who put like $20 into the pot and it was her last $20 and the other guy put in like 100 and was like, I gave more. And Jesus like, surely I'd tell you that that woman gave more because she gave everything she had and you gave out of abundance, a little bit out of
Well
your abundance kind of thing.
well, he was talking percentage wise, right? He was talking percentage, she gave a
No,
much higher percent because she
no,
gave
no,
everything.
no, yeah, well, yeah, exactly, but basically, he was saying she's willing to give it all, and you're just willing and she has little, you know what I mean? And so I guess
Right.
in the context, my 10% would be closer to that end of the spectrum, but to be honest with you, according to the way I stated that I see it, I believe my wife and I would have been consistently given more than the 10%, in more ways than one, so
Okay. Hey, friends, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. And I just want to take a minute to tell you about my book, Everyday Lead. So, if you haven't already purchased the book, it's available on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles. And if you have already purchased the book, then thank you so much for your support. Please leave me a review, it helps out a lot. If you're wondering what it's about, well, I'll just tell you I have 25 years of working in aerospace manufacturing, leading lean transformation, continuous improvement, and Six Sigma projects. And I've tried to take all that knowledge and experience and simplify it so that the average person with no manufacturing experience would not only understand the concepts, but would also be able to apply some very simple tools to their own processes to help eliminate waste. So it doesn't matter whether you're baking a cake or whether you are a nurse or a doctor working in the medical field, or you are an accountant or an attorney. Anywhere there is a process, there is going to be waste. And I'm not talking about rubbish. I'm not talking about things that are left over. I'm talking about defects, overproduction, waiting, non utilized talent, transportation, inventory, motion, excess processing. This simple book, and as you guys can see, it's a very short read here. You can probably get through it in just a couple hours. Basically will help you to understand what that waste looks like in your process and give you some basic guidelines on how to eliminate it. So thank you for your time. I hope you check out the book and enjoy the rest of the show. Well, then you were in the 5%, then the way that you define the tithe, and it sounds like you got some your own math going on going on there while you define it. I'm gonna say, look, I'm gonna say I really don't know, but I'm gonna say I don't think so. And the reason why I would say I don't know is because to me, it is a grace issue, a new covenant issue. It's not something that I've ever really cared to try to adhere to because I'm not under the law, I'm under grace, and I've always given out of my heart. And sometimes that giving out of my heart has been to my church and to my pastor, which I've always tried consistently to do.
Right.
Sometimes it's been to other Christian ministries that have fed me and I think are doing good work out there. Sometimes it does show up in love offerings. Sometimes it shows up to a homeless person, on the
Right.
side of the street that I give
Amen.
to, which I would not say I do all the time, but I do as I feel led to do. And so I would say that, I don't know, but I don't think so. I would say that I don't know because I just have never sat down to take an account of it because I just don't feel like it's that important for me to take an account. I feel like it's more important for me to do it out of love and out of a giving heart when I feel led. And then now, is that a cop out? Is that me saying that like I've done enough? No, I think that as I grow and as I mature in my walk, I think as all of us as Christians grow and mature in our walk, it's something that we should challenge ourselves with. I think it's something for us to evaluate and to think about because, if we look at how we're spending our money, and as I mentioned earlier, I do think that part of the reason why we're told to tithe is to learn money management and to be better stewards of our resources. And if we are, if we do have that mindset and we are evaluating ourselves and our spending habits, I think it's a fair conversation for us to have in terms of, are we spending too much on something that's maybe entertainment or maybe something that would be considered wasteful when we could be giving more to, kingdom work, if you will, more towards the widow and the orphan and to the charities and to the different, things that are going on around us, right? Like I would hate to be in a position where I felt like God was really calling me to give, to a certain organization or a certain cause and not be able to do it because I just blew my money on X, right? A new car that I didn't need, or an extravagant vacation, or whatever, right? Whatever the thing is. So I do think it's something that we should all continue to evaluate, and as we mature and as we grow in our faith, I think that that's something that we should consider. But yeah, I would say for me, I don't think I'm in that 5%. Matter of fact, I could pretty much say that I know I'm not, even though I don't keep an account. But I do believe that I am still walking in the spirit of that Second Corinthians 9, which is, don't do it out of reluctance or compulsion. Do it cheerfully.
Right. 100%, man. Yeah. And, I think it might also be, uh, to the purpose of kind of, you know, keeping like checking in, right? So, what comes to mind is the rich man who, told Jesus like, "Hey, I've kept all the commandments," and Jesus is like, "All right, well, go give away all your money." He's like, "I'm not going to do that." You know what I mean? So I think it's just kind of keeping us mindful to not prioritize money. Obviously the Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil, and so I think it's just in line with that, man. And I. I mean, I would say, like I said, I would say so. Just not. I guess not necessarily that I keep account either, but I do, to be honest with you, because it's my wife on the side of like, being very active with children's ministry and cleaning and stuff like that. I just got to the point where I told her like, hey, to be honest with you, I never kept track. I was like, as far as actual finances, putting in the thing for whatever, to sow into the church, put whatever you feel. You know what I mean? In accordance to everything else that you feel like you're doing, put whatever you feel. So, so that's kind of how we, I guess, gauge that. And my thing was, as far as I feel like any giving that I do is from, I, I tried, I specifically, because like I've mentioned before, money used to be such a big problem for me. I always had it in my mind that however much money I made was my worth and my value, and that's how I gauged my success, and I spent the vast majority of my life with that mentality, thinking, you know what, I'm going to hustle and I'm going to grind and I'm going to be somebody and I'm going to show everybody,
Right.
blah blah blah, and so now I feel completely the opposite. I feel like anything that I have, um, it is not my money. It's a blessing from God. Yeah, he has provided, and and so
Right.
I feel like you said, I feel like all I'm doing is stewarding what God has given me. So
Right. And I'll just say too that I think that, pretty much all of us feel similar to how you felt at some point in our lives, especially men, right? Because, money, that is one of the, items on the world's scoreboard is,
100%.
how much money do you have? How much money do you earn? I think that's definitely one of those items on the world's scoreboard. And so it's something that's kind of, it's hard to, totally like remove from your mind, right? Because obviously we want to provide the best life that we can for our children and for our families, and it takes money to do that, right? And most of us don't want to lower our standard of living. We want to increase our standard of living, right? Whether or not you are, consumed by money, or you have made money, your number one focus in life, it's kind of hard to just live in society and not have it impact you,
Right.
whether you are a covetous person who loves to watch MTV Cribs. I don't know, is that still on?
I don't think.
Lifestyle of the Rich and Famous, geez, that's even older,
Yeah.
or whatever it is. I don't know what the modern version of, you scroll on TikTok and see these people driving supercars. I don't know. Regardless, it's hard to not be impacted at all. Even if you're not totally into that kind of stuff, you're gonna feel it, right? When you're at your job and there's an opportunity for a promotion, you want to do better. You want to make more money if you can, right? If you find out that someone else is getting paid, it's kind of like human nature that you want to get paid more if someone else is getting paid more. It's like all these little things, right? So, and I think again, for like us as men, it's even more, a driving force for us because, yeah, I mean, for men, a lot of how we typically get our worth is, through the work that we do, and, the money we earn and the resources that we can provide for our family. Now we know that that's not where we truly get our worth, because
Right.
where we really get our worth is from being, children of God, right? And we have
Absolutely.
intrinsic value, but it's hard to always have that in, the forefront, of our minds, when we also live in a physical world where, we have needs, and we do have to do things to provide. So, not
Well,
making excuses, but just saying that, that's a struggle that, I'm sure, a lot of people out there can relate to.
and see that that's where, I do enjoy it. And I mean, I do check in with my wife and I'm like, hey, did you make sure that we tied this week? Just to, for me, I intentionally try to, kind of make sure that I don't fall back into that old way. Um, that where money becomes too much of motivation or a focal point. You know what I mean? And it's been awesome, man. Honestly, I thought it was going to be way harder. Um, but the Lord dealt with me, pretty swiftly with that. And man, it really, it felt like gi- giving up that, just that idea of like, man, I gotta grind. I gotta, blah, blah, blah. Like I always gotta be at 110%. And if I'm less than that, then this whole thing falls apart. Like being able to give that to God and saying, look, God, you know what? At the end of the day, I don't care if I got $100 million or if I'm broke. Like I'm a child of the Most High God, and you thought I was important enough to die for me. So, like, just keeping that perspective, and there's times like, I mean, I don't want to give away too many specifics because I'm trying to keep my blessing blessing in heaven. But 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 man, like uh, there was a certain point in time in my life where I was doing something extra to make some extra money, and I didn't think that it was going to be a whole lot, but I was going to give it a shot, and in the very beginning of the process, I felt like God put it on my heart and was like, you know, whatever you get from this, sow it into the church. Like you need to help other
Mm.
people, and I was like, okay, well, I'm like, not expecting it to be much, and it ended up being a pretty substantial amount. I'm not talking about like thousands of dollars, but
Not life changing money, but
no,
it
no,
wasn't it wasn't nothing to sneeze at.
no, right. And it gets up to this point and I'm looking at it like, I could really use there's things that I could do with this money,
Yeah.
but look, the Lord put it on my heart to give it, and that was one of those times where I was like, nope, nope, not falling back into this. Hey, look, you know, I I'm glad. I feel like he put it on my heart for a reason, and I didn't need to know. Nobody needs to know it was me. I put it where it needed to go, and I just was like, Lord, have your way. And I do believe that he multiplied that and blessed people, and that, man, that's, that's how I think about it anyways. And I'm glad that that was the outcome instead of me using it even for whatever I needed, because either way I believe the Lord ended up providing, so, which he always does. So
Well, that's a great story, man. You mind if we do a quick segment for our sponsor, Hey, Everyday Lean?
no, go ahead.
So I just want to just reiterate to everybody out there that the Bible makes it pretty clear in Deuteronomy that if you don't give 10%, you are going to hell. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that 10% is the standard, and if you don't give 10%, you are not going to make it to heaven.
But there's good news. We do not live in that old covenant anymore. There's a new one, and that new
Man,
covenant.
you're ruining my clickbait,
Oh,
okay? I needed a
oh,
clickbait clip for our sponsors out there. You totally ruin it.
right, right. So
I'm just kidding. I'm just
yeah,
kidding. All right, everybody knows we're kidding. Any final thoughts on tithing that you would wrap this up with?
man. Just to reiterate, I don't think that there's a better way to give than with a cheerful heart. I don't think there's a better way to do any
Yeah.
anything than to do it out of love, a place of love. You know what I mean? So yeah,
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would just say that my final thoughts are, as we mentioned, Second Corinthians 9:7, we should give out of our heart, not with reluctance, not under compulsion, not out of any sense of duty or, trying to keep a commandment or fulfill the law. We should give cheerfully. And I would just go a step further and to say that, look, it's between you and the Lord and your
amen.
walk with the Lord, not between you and your pastor or you and any congregation or denomination. If you feel that you should give 10% and that's what the Lord's telling you to do, whether it's before taxes, after taxes, whether that 10% is made up of offerings or just your time or whatever it is, that's between you and the Lord. If you
Yeah,
feel like 5% is good or 1% is good, that's between you and the Lord. That's not for me to judge. That's not for PJ to judge. That's not for your pastor or anyone else to judge. That's between you and the Lord. And just pray about it and consider it and think about how you do spend your time and your money. And if there are things that you feel like God is leading you to, maybe, change and trade off certain things that you do to do other things or certain things you spend your money on to be able to give more, then that's between you and the Lord. Just
amen.
as PJ said, if God speaks to you and says, "Hey, for this portion of your life, for this time, I want you to give this increase to this cause," then you should probably follow your heart there and do it cheerfully. And
Amen.
not be, held to any legalistic standard or feel judged or condemned because God doesn't judge you. God doesn't condemn you.
Or
God has
bullied
given his
into it.
life for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Don't be bullied
100%.
into it, man. That was really well said, man. I mean, I was gonna come back and touch on some of them same points, but I mean, that's perfectly said. And I mean, that's all, you know, can be backed up biblically. So, you know what I mean? If you're hearing it another way, then I would jump in that Bible.
Right, right. And please do jump in the Bible, leave your comments, tell us your thoughts. If you disagree with us, know that at some point we will be reading your comments and giving you our feedback on it. We want to, start a conversation here. So feel free to leave your comments, even if you just totally disagree with us and you're like, nope, I believe it's got to be like this. That's okay. That's what we want to do. We want to have these conversations.
Right. Absolutely.
All right, brother. What do you think?
Think that'll wrap it up for today. What about you?
All right. Well, I think that does it for this episode of Walk Talk. Thank you all so much for listening. If you haven't already, please follow the show. And before you go, leave your thoughts in the comments below. God
God
bless.
bless.
Hey, friends, I just want to tell you about my book, Everyday Lean. After 25 years of leading continuous improvement projects in the manufacturing world, I came to a simple realization. Lean applies to any process because every process has waste. Whether you're baking a cake, developing software, or building an F 15, the same principles apply. Everyday Lean gives language and structure to what you're likely already doing. It's all about helping people and organizations make their work better every day. Everyday Lean is available now on Amazon and Barnes& and Nobles.